Mark was 24, with a mind that never stopped talking. During the day, he pretended to be fine. At night, he fought thoughts that wouldn't let him sleep. Nothing was wrong with the world around him. The problem was the noise inside his head. And the harder he tried to quiet it, the louder it became. He had a good job, loyal friends, and a promising future, everything someone his age could hope for. But no achievement brought him any rest. There was always that inner voice saying, "You need to be better. You still haven't done enough. What if everything goes wrong tomorrow?" The alarm rang every morning, but Mark was already awake. Not out of discipline, but because sleep had long abandoned him. The ceiling above his bed had become a mirror, a screen where old memories, regrets, and unnamed fears played endlessly. He drank his morning coffee staring at his phone, lost between news, messages, deadlines, and promises. It felt like the whole world was screaming for his attention, and he couldn't hear himself anymore. With every buzz, every notification, another piece of him seemed to crack. His friends would ask, "Hey man, you okay? You look tired." And he'd smile. He always smiled. But inside, everything was drained. One night, lying in bed, he realized he was at war with his own thoughts. It was like trying to hold back a flood with his hands. The more he fought, the more he drowned. The next morning, he left without a plan. He wandered through the cold streets of Denver, watching the hurried faces, each person carrying their own invisible world of worries. Suddenly, he felt disconnected from it all. Like his body was there, but his soul was somewhere else. That's when he overheard a random conversation. Two old men were talking near a bus stop. One of them said, "Up in the mountains of Crestone, there's a man who teaches people how to find peace." Mark stopped for a moment. He didn't know why, but those words pierced right through him. A man who teaches people how to find peace. As if that were even possible. In the days that followed, the thought wouldn't leave his mind. He tried to focus on work, but his thoughts kept drifting to that mysterious place. There was a small, persistent voice whispering, "Go there. What do you have to lose?" 3 weeks later, in the quiet of dawn, Mark got out of bed and stood still in the dark, staring at his reflection in the window. There stood a young man with his whole life ahead of him, yet completely empty inside. He grabbed a small backpack, packed some clothes, an old notebook, his phone, which he turned off, and a bottle of water. He left before sunrise. The air on the road smelled of freedom and loneliness. With each mile, he drifted farther from the world he knew, and something inside him began to settle. The city noise faded. The sound of the wind, the birds, and his own heartbeat took its place. The first 2 days were strange. The silence was almost uncomfortable. Without distractions, his thoughts came back even stronger. Memories, fears, regrets. But as he kept walking, he realized not everything needed to be solved. Some things just needed to be seen. On the third night, staying at a small village surrounded by pines, he heard about the man in the mountains again. "He lives alone, past the creek," said the innkeeper. "Hardly anyone ever sees him, but those who do come back changed." The next morning, Mark set off early, following a narrow trail covered in mist. The sound of the creek followed his steps. The air was cold, pure, and time seemed to slow down. When he finally spotted a wooden cabin, his heart raced. On the porch sat an old man, his eyes calm, staring at the horizon. He didn't seem surprised to see him. "What are you looking for?" the old man asked. Mark took a deep breath. Silence. Peace.
I can't stand the noise in my head anymore." The old man looked at him as if he recognized something familiar. "So you came to try and stop the river?" Mark frowned. "The river?" "The mind," the old man said. "It never stops. But if you learn to watch it flow, you stop drowning." Silently, the old man went inside and came back with a glass of water. He handed it to Mark and said, "Walk to the end of the trail and come back without spilling a drop." Mark obeyed. The trail was rough, the wind cold, the stones uneven, but he never took his eyes off the glass. He focused so hard on not spilling it that he didn't hear the birds, didn't notice the people around him. When he returned, the old man asked him, "Did you spill any?" "No." "And what did you see along the way?" Mark thought for a moment. "Nothing. I was just trying not to spill." The old man smiled. "That's right. When the mind is full, it stumbles. When it's present, the world grows quiet." Mark said nothing. For the first time in a long time, the silence inside him wasn't empty. It was peace.
The old man never said his name, and Mark never asked. It was as if the name didn't matter. In the days that followed, the two barely spoke. Mark helped with small tasks, gathering firewood, lighting the fire, fetching water from the creek. Everything was done in silence. No explanations, no hurry. At first, the quiet made him uneasy. He missed instructions, inspiring quotes, some kind of step-by-step that could tell him what he was supposed to be doing there. But the old man only watched him, sometimes smiling, sometimes just gazing at the horizon, as if waiting for something invisible inside Mark to ripen. During the day, the sound of the wind blended with the distant songs of birds. At night, the fire crackled inside the cabin, lighting up the old man's calm face. Mark tried to meditate, but his mind kept running back to the same places. Work, unanswered messages, decisions that haunted him. The old man said little, but when he did, his words seemed to cut through time. Silence isn't what happens when sound ends. It's what remains when you stop identifying with the noise. Those words echoed inside Mark, even when he didn't fully understand them. They felt like seeds, and somehow he knew they needed time to grow. One morning, the old man took him to a cliff overlooking the entire valley. "Watch," he said. Mark stood there, the wind striking his face. Below, the river snaked between the rocks, reflecting the sky. The old man asked, "What do you see?" "Mountains, trees, the river," Mark replied. "And what do you hear?" Mark paused. "The wind and the sound of water." The old man nodded. "Now, close your eyes." Mark obeyed. "What do you hear now?" "The same sounds." "And what changed?" Mark thought for a moment. "Before, I was looking. Now, I'm just feeling." The old man smiled. "When you stop looking at the world as something outside of you, you begin to feel it as part of yourself." "And what does that have to do with the mind?" Mark asked. "Everything," said the old man. "The mind is like a river that tries to separate itself from the ocean. But the river doesn't need to fight to return. It only needs to let go." Mark took a deep breath. For the first time, he understood, not with his thoughts, but with his body. It wasn't a logical lesson. It was something that happened inside him. That night, as the fire crackled, the old man broke the silence. Tomorrow, you'll be alone." Mark looked at him confused. "What do you mean?" "You need to learn how to be with your own mind without running from it." "And what if I go crazy?" Mark asked, half joking, half afraid. The old man smiled. "Everyone goes a little crazy before they find peace." The next morning, the old man handed him a lantern, a piece of bread, and a blanket. "Go to the top of the mountain. Stay there until sunrise. Watch what happens inside you." Mark climbed the trail in silence. With every step, his breath grew heavier and the wind colder. When he reached the top, the world seemed suspended. He sat down. The sun had already set. Darkness wrapped around him, along with a biting cold. At first, he tried to focus on his breathing, the way he'd seen in videos and books. But soon the thoughts came, all at once. The past, the people he'd hurt, the chances he'd missed, the fear of the future, the loneliness. It was as if the silence amplified everything. Without distractions, his mind began to scream. "Why did you come here? None of this makes sense. You're wasting your life." Mark wanted to run, to go back down, find the old man and ask for instructions, anything. But then he remembered the words. The river doesn't need to fight. It just needs to flow. So he stayed. He didn't fight. He didn't try to think positive. He simply let the noise happen. The wind whistled between the rocks. The cold bit his skin. And amid all that, a small spark of awareness observed everything. He realized something. I'm not the noise. I'm the one who hears it. The realization struck like lightning. Simple, deep, freeing. Slowly, the thoughts began to lose their grip, like leaves falling into a stream, carried away by the current. Mark felt his body relax. The cold was still there, the wind too, but inside him, there was a new kind of silence. That night, sitting on a rock, he experienced something he'd never felt before. Not the absence of thoughts, but the absence of attachment to them. It was like watching his own mind from the outside, without needing to interfere. When the sun rose, the sky turned shades of orange and gold. Mark cried, not from sadness, but from relief. It felt like coming home after being lost his whole life. When he came down the mountain, the old man was waiting by the creek, sitting just as before. Mark said nothing. He knelt and drank a handful of water. The old man asked, "What did you find up there?" Mark paused for a moment. "Myself, but in a way I'd never seen before." The old man smiled. "The mind is like a dark room. You spend years fighting the shadows when all you ever needed was to turn on the light." They sat in silence for a few minutes. Mark watched the surface of the water, calm, clear, reflecting the sky. It was the same landscape as before, but something inside him had changed. In the weeks that followed, life stayed simple. Wood, tea, walks. But now, Mark wasn't searching for answers. He simply was. Sometimes he thought about the past, sometimes about the future, but the thoughts came and went, like clouds in a sky that no longer mistook itself for the storm. One afternoon, he asked the old man, "How did you learn all this?" The old man replied, "I too had a mind that wouldn't stop. I searched through books, teachers, religions, until I realized the problem wasn't the mind itself. It was believing everything it said." Mark smiled. "So there's nothing to achieve?" "Nothing," said the old man. "There's only what needs to be released.
Those words echoed inside him. Nothing to achieve, only what needs to fall away. For years, he'd believed peace was a reward, a trophy earned through effort. But now he saw, peace is what remains when you stop holding on to the weight. A month passed. Winter was approaching, and snow began to settle over the mountains. One night, the old man called Mark outside the cabin. The sky was blanketed with stars. "You'll be leaving soon," the old man said. "The world you left behind is still there, but you won't be the same." Mark looked toward the horizon. Part of him feared returning, feared losing that serenity once he faced the city's noise again. The old man seemed to read his thoughts. "Peace doesn't live here in the mountains, boy. It lives in you. If it depends on a place, you'll lose it. But if it grows from within, it will follow you." Mark nodded, eyes glistening. "And if I forget?" he asked. "Then breathe again," the old man said. "Each breath is a doorway back." The firelight flickered across the old man's face. Mark watched him in silence, trying to memorize every detail. The sound of the wind, the scent of wood smoke, the calm in his eyes. He wanted to remember that moment forever. Later that night, alone in the cabin, he opened the notebook he'd brought. The first pages were full of old notes, to-do lists, scattered ideas, things that once seemed important. Now they just looked like noise. On a blank page, he wrote a single sentence. "Silence is the teacher who speaks when everything else grows quiet." He closed the notebook, smiled, and fell asleep. And as the wind whispered outside, Mark dreamed, not of the future, not of the past, but of the simple act of being alive.
Winter settled over the mountains like a white, silent veil. The wind carried the scent of snow, and the mornings arrived so cold that the wood in the cabin cracked and popped. Mark knew it was time to leave. He didn't feel it out of impatience, but out of understanding. The learning was complete, not because he had grasped everything, but because there was nothing left to grasp. The old man brewed tea, just as he did every morning. He poured it without saying a word. Mark watched him for a moment. The slow gestures, the calm that felt as ancient as the mountains themselves. "Thank you," he said softly. The old man looked up, wearing that half-smile that said more than words ever could. "Thank the silence," he replied. "It's the one that taught you." For a while, neither spoke. The fire crackled between them. Outside, snow had begun to fall. Mark packed his bag. He carried almost nothing, just a notebook and a change of clothes. The old man walked him to the edge of the trail. "Going back isn't the same as going backward," the elder said. "When the mind is still, the world becomes new, even if nothing is changed." Mark nodded. "And what if the noise returns?" "It will," the old man replied. "But now you know, the noise isn't the problem. It's just the sound of the river flowing." The old man turned and walked back toward the cabin. Mark stood there for a while, gazing at the snow-covered mountain. He took a deep breath. Then he began to walk. The trail looked different. The same trees, the same rocks, but everything seemed sharper, more alive. Each step felt like the beat of a soft drum, reminding him that he was here, now. As he walked, he noticed how the world constantly tried to steal his attention. Birds, noises, memories, desires, all inviting him to drift away again. But now he watched it all the way one watches the rain pass, without resistance, without attachment. He reached the small village by late afternoon. People chatted, dogs barked,
and the smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. It was ordinary life, the same as always, and for the first time he felt part of it, not separate from it. He stopped in front of a shop window. His reflection stared back at him. The face hadn't changed much, but the eyes had. Less tension, less searching. There was a kind of silence behind them. On the bus ride back to Denver, he watched people sleep, type, scroll endlessly through their phones. For a long time he'd been just like them. But now, sitting there, breathing calmly, he realized something simple yet profound. The world didn't need to slow down for him to find peace. He just needed to stop running inside himself. Return to the city. When he arrived, the city felt louder than ever, honking horns, chatter, flashing ads. But inside him there was space, a space the noise couldn't fill. He returned to his apartment. Same ceiling, same couch, but now the silence there wasn't suffocating, it was comforting. He turned on his phone. Hundreds of messages, emails, notifications. For a few seconds, he just looked at the screen. Then he simply turned it off. The sound of the click felt liberating. He opened his notebook. On the last pages he wrote, "The mind creates the noise. Silence reveals what's always been there." He closed his eyes and breathed. For a moment he felt the mountain again, the wind, the cold, the stream. But now, all of it lived within him. In the days that followed, life returned to its usual rhythm. Work, meetings, conversations, traffic. Nothing had changed on the outside, but everything had changed within. At first, serenity came easily. Then the world began to test him. One morning, his boss called a tense meeting. The project was behind schedule, and everyone was blaming someone else. Mark sat, listening to the complaints, the raised voices, the chaos. But inside, he was calm. While everyone argued, he observed, and he saw. The confusion wasn't in the room, it was in people's minds. Everyone was reacting to thoughts, memories, fears, and he had done the same before. When his turn to speak, he used few words. Clear, direct, calm. Gradually, the room grew quieter, not because he demanded silence, but because his calm was contagious. After the meeting, a coworker came up to him. "Man, what have you been doing? You seem like a different person." Mark smiled. "I learned to listen to the silence before answering the noise." The man laughed, thinking it was a metaphor, but to Mark, it was literal. A few weeks later, he went to a bookstay cafe he used to visit. There he noticed an older woman sitting alone, quietly crying. Something in him pushed him to approach. "Are you okay?" he asked. She wiped her tears, embarrassed. "It's just hard to quiet my head sometimes, you know? It never stops talking to me." Mark smiled gently. "I know. I used to live that way too." She looked at him curiously. "So what did you do?" He paused for a moment, then said, "I listened to the silence until I understood what it was trying to tell me." She frowned slightly, trying to make sense of it. And Mark added, "Silence isn't empty. It's the place where everything true is revealed." Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time for a different reason. "Thank you," she whispered. Mark just smiled. He didn't preach or offer advice. He simply let his presence speak for him. Months later, when the mountain snow began to melt, Mark felt a pull to return to Crestone. Not to seek something, but to give thanks. He took the same bus, the same path, the same trail. But when he reached the village, something unexpected happened. No one had ever heard of an old man in the mountains. He asked around. Everyone said there were only ruins up there, no cabin. One man chuckled. An old man in the mountains? No one's lived up there in at least 10 years. Mark said nothing. He climbed anyway. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from reverence. When he reached the place where the cabin should have been, he found only a small circle of stones and what looked like the remains of an ancient fire. No sign of the old man. No trace that anyone had lived there for years. He sat on a rock and looked at the horizon. The same valley, the same river, the same wind. He closed his eyes and heard a calm, familiar voice inside. Peace isn't the mountains. It's in you. Mark smiled, and for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to empty the mind. It wasn't about erasing thoughts. It was about making space so the present could breathe. Years later, Mark lived a simple life. He hadn't become a monk or a writer or a speaker. He still worked, laughed, loved, but at a different rhythm, a rhythm that came from within. Sometimes people would ask, "Don't you ever get angry or worried?" He'd laugh, "Of course I do. The difference is now I can watch my mind stir without drowning in it." One evening, walking through the city, he saw a young man sitting on a bench, staring blankly ahead. There was something familiar in his face, the same quiet desperation Mark once carried. Mark approached and said gently, "It's okay. You're just listening to the wrong noise." The boy looked up, puzzled. "What do you mean?" Mark pointed to his chest. "There's a place in here that never makes a sound. If you learn to listen to that, you'll find out who you really are." The boy fell silent, and Mark continued walking, disappearing among the city lights. The wind blew softly. The noise of traffic blended with the sounds of the night, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause. Not because the world had gone quiet, but because within him, silence was stronger than the noise. Mark took a deep breath, smiled, and thought, "The mind is a river. I am the lake that receives it." And so, walking under the Denver sky, he finally understood the peace he had searched in the mountains had always been with him. He just needed to listen to the silence.